Oh man, no, it's one of the 23 commandments of 4. Don't mix dairy and baby.
I'm Brodor. This is Why We Game. Our guest today is Craig Campbell, freelance writer, architect, award-winning RPG designer, podcaster, made of 1 million ants, often friendly, and he cut his teeth in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, learning to game. Craig, how are you?
Good, Mike. Hi.
It is really wonderful to meet you. I have to tell you, I'm a little bit nervous. So for people that know me and listen to the show, you reached out to me via Pete Petruccia, the most beautiful man in gaming. And, you said, hey, I'd love to talk about gaming and be on the show. And I'm a whore, so I want to interview anyone who will give me their time. So thank you. But you have had a long, long career in the hobby industry in terms of the amount of freelance writing and stuff that you have done. I mean, I would call it long, and in my opinion, I think that you've done a lot of work. And so, digging around and looking at your name, I'm like, oh my God, this guy knows people. I better not shit the bed.
Well, I mean, relative to people who have made their full-time living in freelancing, and there are people who have done that where they have, hundreds of credits. For somebody who has mostly done this as a side gig, and it's really, I shouldn't even say mostly, really done it entirely as a side gig. I have had a day job the entire time. I did quite a bit of freelancing. I have to go through and complete the list, compile it, but it's like close to 40 freelancing credits. Most of them coming before I started designing my own games and publishing them, but a few since. And it's been, it's officially over 20 years since the first thing I wrote for money.
Yeah. So if you've taken any portion of your life that is in excess of 10 to 15%, and you've done that consistently and made a name for yourself, that's a long career as far as I'm concerned.
I guess so. Yeah. So, I'm an old timer. I'm somebody who has seen the change in how you get into the industry. Like when I first got in, it was very much through what people kind of think of as the old school. Like you met people at conventions or at the store or game day, and eventually you kind of met somebody who was in the industry. It was all networking. It was all like in-person networking. And you had to kind of meet people that way. Or maybe you submitted to the few publications that had, that accepted open calls and, accepted submissions. And now, telling people that story, it's like, it sounds a little ancient because like there's so many other ways now with all the online content that there is and social media and all the different ways to get your product out there just by blogging and posting and having a website and contributing to like little things that get put into PDF form or all that sort of thing. And then meeting people and networking via social media, which is perhaps a little more conducive to some folks who would perhaps, be more anxious if they were meeting like a game designer in person at a convention, or who can't attend those conventions and just can't make it to those sorts of things. So people can get into stuff like that. So I've watched everything shift. When I tell my story of like how I did it, it's like, that's just not, there aren't a lot of people that do it that way anymore.
No, it's true. And I have to tell you, for me, I absolutely missed my opportunity, right? Like if I was going to do what it is that you and Pete and many of my other guests have done, I would have had to do it during the time of that opportunity. Because frankly, right here, you and I meeting over technology, that's out of necessity, not out of a desire for me. I've realized recently that I'm never going to break out and be bigger than I am right now because I don't have that hustle, right? Like here you are, you're a guy who by day, you're an architect, which is no fucking joke, right? That's hard work. It's hard education. It's very precise. It's very detail oriented. Not only does it take an understanding of creativity and art, but also engineering. And then you come home and you're prolifically writing freelance stuff and writing your own adventures, and you're managing over a dozen Kickstarters and another one upcoming. Dude, I don't have that, right? Like I talk to all these people and I see how smart they are and creative and funny and charismatic. Dude, I roll with all of that. Dude, I don't have the hustle. It's just not there. Dude, I don't. And that's not me being disparaging. It's recognizing that there is a distinction between people like you and professionals in the industry and those of us that don't ever break in.
To an extent, that can be true, sure. Like, there's plenty of people, perhaps like yourself, who don't have it in them or aren't interested in pursuing kind of like the level of what you refer to as hustle, that myself or someone else who's very prolific. There are plenty of opportunities to just speaking to the listeners out there who are like, well, I'd like to do a little something. There's plenty of people, plenty of opportunities to do a little something. Like if you just want to kind of dip your toes in every now and then, you don't have to have all that hustle. You can just like, oh, I'll make a little thing and I'll put it up on, like if you're a D&D person, put it up on DM's Guild and get it into the hands of some people, or make a small game, like a zine kind of thing, and run a Kickstarter sometime when it's just zine and, a zine kind of thing where it's real small scale. You're going to do PDF and real simple soft cover printing. And you want to do that like once a year or every other year or something like that, just to kind of get your creative juices flowing and put your creativity out into the world in some way. You can do that.
All right, so here's another common trait, listener, that people in the industry have is positivity. There's this, no, I'm serious. I talk to people and you see a level of optimism, right? Like you're so open. You're like, hey, you don't have to hustle like I do. You can do it just like anybody else. You just do it at your own pace. Where me, I'm immediately defeated where I'm like, well, if I can't do it as well as that guy, I'm not going to fucking bother. Anyway, enough about me. And obviously compliments make you uncomfortable. So let's go.
No. Okay. Well, I'll point this out though, too. Like, my own pace has changed over time. There was a time when I freelanced and did like, maybe two freelance gigs a year that weren't terribly large. So I would, piddle around with one for a few months and then put that out there and get paid a few dollars. And then I would piddle around with another one, but there'd be chunks of time in between, like now it's a different beast. Now I've got, like a much heftier schedule. It's a much more packed schedule. Will the schedule that I've seen over the last couple of years continue? Not necessarily. Things can slow down for a variety of reasons. But yeah, things have been pretty wild for like the last 3 years. Pretty hectic.
Before we get into your background and history and your discovery of tabletop, I want to ask, I assume that during the pandemic, because of social isolation, etc., you have had more opportunity to focus on your writing?
Yeah, the reason you see what happened with NerdBruger Games last year and this year with the many Kickstarters and lots of product and lots of, like, I did an online convention last year, 2 years ago, and then again last year, was just, having more time. I wasn't going out to socialize as much. I was relying on quick interactions more. You do online interaction stuff where like I'm getting my social interaction out of playing in online games, one shots now and then, rather than playing in campaigns. I wasn't going out and doing social stuff with people as much because I was home more. And on top of it, it lends itself to the fact that I am single and without children. So I don't have like other responsibilities in the home. I can just be like, I'm just going to sit down and write for 8 hours today. Does anybody have a problem with that? No answer. So I can sit down and write for 8 hours on a Saturday. So yeah, a lot of that. And that's why I'm expecting that things might tail off a little bit more as my social schedule, and not going to conventions too. That's a thing too. Like a few years ago, I'd go to 5, 6, 7 conventions a year, a few local ones, a couple of bigger ones. And that would not only eat up the weekend of the convention, but if I had a presence at the convention for whatever, you were killing a lot of time. Just like, I got to prep. Am I a guest? Am I got books at the vendor hall? Am I running games? Do I have to prep games for stuff to do? Do I have to wrangle other people to come with me as part of like the little NerdBruger Games team, which I've done a few times? Like, that's a lot of time that gets eaten up for that sort of thing too. So that's all time that you don't put toward actually, continued development of games. I'm just as interested as anybody else to see how NerdBruger Games might fluctuate in its output over the course of the next couple of years. Once, now that I am going to have more of that time taken up by going to conventions and doing other things.
Can we jump in the time machine and go back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, pre-Dahmer? We have a young Craig discovering tabletop gaming. So I assume, just based on your age or your presented age, that Dungeons and Dragons was your first game.
Second edition, 1991.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a little later. So they were in the Dahmer time then.
Yeah. Well, I was in Milwaukee for when the Dahmer thing happened, and it was an experience to be in a city where something like that was going on. But yeah, it was 1991. It was toward the end of my freshman year, like just before we were going home for the summer, and my friend Brian, who I'd met that year, said, "Hey, we should play Dungeons and Dragons. I think you'd really like this game." And it was second edition. He knew I liked horror games, so we played Ravenloft. It was just the one session. Didn't really get a chance to do too deep of a dive into what Ravenloft is, other than kind of just scratching the surface of, oh, it's horror. So played that game, and then was like off to home for the summer. I'm not going to see my friends at college for 3 months, but I bought the books. And then I just kind of devoured them over the summer. And then back that next year, we played more. And then a year later, Brian and myself and a couple of other guys all moved into the same suite together at the dorms. We saw each other constantly. And so we played a lot over the course of a couple of years that we were all kind of, essentially roommates. And then just kind of expanded from there. We played some Shadowrun and some Star Wars, the West End games, the Blue Book, and a handful of other things, and then just rolled from there. Kind of like discovered World of Darkness, and then Deadlands came out, and I fell in love with that, and I ran a lot of Deadlands for a while, and on and on and on, and then eventually just kind of I was GMing from like my second year. Like I started playing, and I was involved in I GM'd some stuff pretty quickly, and then it was 1999 when I actually started like writing for other people's consumption outside of like the game group where I freelanced for something. And then that was kind of sporadic as well. Like it was, there was a build.
How in the hell did gaming not find you until 91? You and you're a couple years older than I am. I'm going to, just based on my math, assuming that you were 17, 18 years old in 91 when you were a freshman, right? So you're a couple years older than I am, I assume. But how did you go all the way from adolescence to college and not fucking game?
In Wisconsin.
Yeah, no.
Where D&D was invented. Exactly. I'll tell you how.
I want to move to Wisconsin. I got to go to GameholeCon for the first time last year. Dude, I want to live there. Right? I mean, that's my fucking mecca. That Wisconsin is home.
Yeah, and people, there's a lot of people that don't realize, if you live in different parts of the world or different parts of the U.S., that it is like that. Like there are parts of Wisconsin and in a few other Midwestern states too, but particularly Wisconsin, where it is uniquely prevalent. Like there's just so much gaming. Like when I was at UW Milwaukee, you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting a group of gamers. There was a game store called Napoleon's, and it was like half historical minis, old school war games, and then also RPGs and some board games and stuff. And there was always people with the little paper up there with the little Terra phone numbers to find groups. And they were always like all gone. Like there was always people, because it was just everybody gamed. Now, I think what happened for me, why it took me until college, was I grew up in a very small town in northeastern Wisconsin. I graduated with 62 people in my class. So I brushed up against Dungeons and Dragons one time without really knowing it. And I knew the D&D cartoon, so I knew Dungeons and Dragons was a game, but I just never came across it in any bookstores or anything in the slightly larger towns that we went to for that sort of thing. And there was one point where I was hanging around with a guy in my class named Joe who had one of the old box sets, and I saw the dice and I was like, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, we should play that sometime." And we just never did. Like he mentioned it once, and then it just kind of never came up again. So I had this like, given how important gaming has been in my life, in cinematic terms, I had the brush with gaming in the night where we just kind of walked past each other on the dark street. And I got a whiff of gaming's perfume, and I was like, oh, and then I forgot about it for a long time. But then, it eventually kind of crept back in with college.
So in 99 then, what inspired you to take your shot? What made you say, you know what, fuck it, I'm going to try to do this? And what game, I mean, just actually, you know what, let me just take me down that project through A, the thought process of I'm going to do it, and B, the project that you submitted.
It fell into my lap, sort of, because I was going to school, or had been going to school for a while, with a guy named Jason Bulmahn, who designed Pathfinder. At the time, he was an architecture student, and we met each other, and we gamed, and we played Magic, and all this sort of stuff. And then, kind of toward the end of the 90s, when third edition D&D happened, they started living Greyhawk. And he and a couple of other people from Milwaukee became the triad that kind of ran the Highfolk region for Greyhawk. If you recall from Living Greyhawk, Living Campaign, they took the United States and broke them up into pieces. And then they also took different parts of the world and broke them up into pieces and said, okay. And then they took the world of Earth and broke it up into pieces and assigned parts of the world. And Highfolk was specifically assigned to Wisconsin. And this is another way to point out how prevalent gaming is in Wisconsin. There were only a few states that got their own region, and Wisconsin was one of them. Most of the times it was like this whole chunk of the country, or this whole 3 countries over here in Europe got a region or something like that, right? But Highfolk specifically just to Wisconsin. And for year 1, they had to write, instead of normally later, they wrote 8 modules for the region where you could play through 8 modules and take your character along. For the year 1, for the kickoff, they needed 12. And that was a lot for the 3 administrators to write and also kind of administrate and plan for conventions and all that sort of thing. So I wrote the last one. I was, gaming with Jason at the time on weekend games. And he said, hey, I've played in your game. You write some, you come up with some cool adventure ideas. Do you want to write one down? And I wrote an adventure called Winter Tears for the Highfolk region, which was about the group discovering a despondent dryad who, she and her tree were in a forest where Ayuz was, his corruption and his darkness was encroaching on the land and was going to kill her tree and therefore kill her. And she had fallen in love with a ranger of the Vespi forest, and he had gone off to have this magic item created that would allow her and her tree to be transported, but then he got waylaid by a monster and captured to be eaten. So it was the damsel in distress hired us to go save the hero that was supposed to save her, and didn't hire us, but pled with us to do that. And so that was the story, and it was it was called Winter Tears. It was about as winter approached and she was despondent, and there was an ice creature in a cave, and there was bargaining with a demonic guy named Bargle, who was later revealed to be some sort of descendant or relation of Ayuz. One of my favorite little moments in this was I wrote, there's a point where you're trying to find information. You're trying to figure out where this monster is and where the ranger's been taken. And you run into Bargle, and he'll bargain with you. If you can give him something that he wants. But you're playing first level characters, so you don't have anything powerful magic wise. You don't have a lot of money, but he will take your soul. You can sign away your soul. And we actually had a handout that we would sign away, and you would sign your name, your character's name, their level at the time, and your RPGA number. And if you signed away your soul, and many people did, and then years later, they had to all these players had to deal with that when the time came for their souls to be taken, and they had a whole little side adventure that they got to do in order to be able to continue playing their character.
That's amazing. So I want to take a tangent, if you don't mind. And I know that it is not kosher to refer to other guests that I've had on the show. But last week, I had the opportunity to interview another freelance writer named Lewis Porter Jr. Lewis and I were having a conversation about not living Greyhawk specifically, but about league play. And he had this theory that the real amazing thing, the next big nut to crack, is living or organized play in the digital environment. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that as somebody who was involved in living Greyhawk, who saw the paper organization of it and the effort that went into running it. What opportunities do you see there in the current popularity of D&D and with the technology we have available for doing something again like a Living Forgotten Realms or a Living Kryn or...
But in the digital realm.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely the possibility for doing something like that. There is organized play on a smaller scale with some companies and some games, Magpie Games, who have a whole bunch of Powered by the Apocalypse games. They have like an organized play, like every month there's a certain number of games, and they're usually either one shots or like very short campaigns, like 2 to 4 sessions, where you come in and you can play a character for a few sessions. They don't do anything super long term in that category right now, but who knows, maybe. They've got the loyalty of the fan base to do something like that. I think, certainly D&D, Pathfinder, maybe 1 or 2 other games have a fan base large enough to support something like that. It's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of planning and organization and keeping it running and interesting and always attracting people and always bringing new players in, because you're going to lose some. You're always going to kind of bleed some players out. So you have to always kind of be growing. The tough part about it will be competing with the ease with which you can find other games, because the big draw, I think, that pen and paper organized play had a decade plus ago was if you didn't have a group, at the very least, there was a way you could go to a convention and play an organized play, and that gave you the experience of being able to play the same character over and over, rather than just doing a one-shot sort of thing. And that scarcity doesn't exist in the same way anymore amongst people who have the digital access. If you can have a little basic webcam and a microphone, and you can do online stuff, you can find games. Now, the question is, like, can you find the games you want? Are you finding the game that you want to play? If D&D is the game you want to play, it's got a large enough fan base that I think it could probably build something in that realm. But it's a little different beast, because you're not dealing with the scarcity that you once were. But that's been the draw for conventions a lot of time too, is like somebody lives in a little town, they don't have a lot of, they like games, but they just can't have a game group. Maybe they only get the game once in a while when their friends are back home for the holidays or something like that. But then they can go to a convention or 2 or 3, and they can get their fix for a while. And organized play was a way to do that with your character, continually. Somewhere in there's a different tactic that needs to be taken.
I would argue that a need exists, but it is different. It is easier to access gaming now in the digital age. However, as a former retailer, that's what most of my background is in the hobby industry, is retail. Even is just a few years ago, the most common problem among gamers is trying to find a group with whom to play. I think there's a market there, and I think it could be monetized, and it's for people who are much smarter than me. But I think as the hobby grows, you can't help but run into that problem again. And I agree with you. It is much easier to find a group than it's ever been. But boy, finding the game that I want to play, organized by the people. I mean, shit, when I went to GameholeCon, the number of tables that I saw playing D&D Beyond, it was amazing. I mean, it was a more congealed and dedicated group of people playing Dungeons and Dragons than I have seen at conventions since the advent of 5th edition. I mean, it was amazing. So they're there. I just feel like that's a mystery that someone much more clever than I has to solve.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. But it's like we're talking about here. There's probably going to be some hit and miss, right? The first year or 2 that it's around, they're going to try this, they're going to try that. There's a sweet spot to be found, but it's going to be figuring out what that is to make something like that happen and be appealing and have enough of it, but not so much that you end up with like groups that don't get filled and you have GMs that are just sitting around, because you're asking for these volunteers to do stuff, and it's going to be a continual thing, like getting GMs involved to do this sort of thing continually. It's one thing to have GMs that are willing to show up to a convention and I'm going to go to a convention for 3 days and I'm just going to GM 3 tables a day for 3 days. And that's going to be great because I love GMing. But does that GM want to GM 2 games every weekend for the next 6 months?
Not without getting paid.
Yeah. So maybe the sweet spot for it is to put it into the gaming weekend model. Maybe it becomes we'll have this online thing and it'll be quarterly or, every other month or something where they okay, now we're going to have a 3-day thing where we're just going to have all sorts of games and we got GMs lined up for it. And you can come on, you can play your character over, through the levels and you can play this and do that all this weekend. And then in a couple months, you can do it again all weekend.
Like I said, someone more clever than me can figure out a way to.
Basically, it's an online convention sort of model. Maybe that's the way to do it. But will it work that way? Got to do it a couple times to see. Can't judge it on one. May not have gotten the word out enough. Can't really judge it on twice. May not have gotten the word out enough. Got to go 3-4 times and see if you can build it to the point where it's okay, now it's kind of worth doing it. And then you'll have the people who will be like, well, I was there for the first one. When we were only 25% filled and half the GMs went home without a table.
Yeah, well, and you could do, with the small press, printing, and there's those cool things they do now that if you do it's not the Mordor fun run, but they have that mock. You can, in order to get you to encourage you to exercise, you can sign up for a thing where, hey, we've moved from the Shire to here, and I've done X number of miles, and so I get sent a medal. You could do medals and challenge coins and all sorts of cool collectible shit that years later gets sold for a premium on eBay. But I'm going down a pretty crazy tangent.
Yeah, who knows? If organizing that sort of thing is the sort of thing that you're into, that would be a very cool place to be right now, is to experiment and figure out how to make that all work. To have that moment when it all finally comes together after a bunch of work and maybe a few of these things where it didn't really take off too well, but it took a little while to kind of get going. Just the catharsis of having it happen and be yeah, I helped to make this really cool thing happen. That's not terribly different from the high of getting a game published or an adventure published in a magazine or whatever.
You can't tell me that Wizards of the Coast and people there couldn't put something together where then at Gen Con you get to be at the final table, game mastered by B. Dave Walters, right? And, they could absolutely do it. Anyway.
Well, the killer is, I'll say this. That's not something that Wizards of the Coast will do. That'll be a third party that will license to do that.
All right.
Almost certainly.
Let's go down this.
Wizards of the Coast R&D makes D&D brand products. They don't run D&D brand games. That's not how they really function anymore.
Because they're just like Games Workshop.
Even in the old days, it was the RPGA that ran the events. Wasn't Wizards, wasn't TSR. The RPGA was affiliated with different companies and ran certain types of games because of it. So that's what you kind of, there also needs to be this entity that takes on this challenge. Which is another hurdle.
Yeah. Now, I have always advocated when I was a retailer and even now that Wizards of the Coast they're wonderful advocates for Dungeons and Dragons. They're great stewards. I think the game is very much flourished under the guidance or the steering of WotC, but they don't want to do business with 3-tier distribution. They never have. They've always acted against the retailer. Not always, that's not fair. In most cases, they have acted against the interest of the retailer to promote their game. And I don't blame them. They're a business trying to make money, but with them making the digital moves that they're doing, part of me thinks that somebody at WotC, there's a secret cabal and that they're going to take over more and more market share with this new digital model where the consumer is encouraged more and more to go directly to WotC. Now, am I crazy or?
No, not necessarily. That may be entirely the situation. And if that happens, I will be surprised. So go ahead, WotC, surprise me. Don't farm it out to somebody like you've done with a few other things. I don't know their business plans. I have precisely zero inside scoop. All the people that I had any inside scoop with either don't work with me anymore or, I haven't worked with for freelancing or anything in many years. So I don't know. Maybe.
Let's go back to D&D second edition. What was it about that experience that hooked you, right? Like we all have that gaming epiphany. We all have that moment where we know this is, dude, it bit me, man. That shit's in my blood now. I'm never getting rid of it. What was yours?
Oh, that's a tough question, but I've tried my hand at writing creatively in a number of ways. I've written poetry, I've written like just free stuff, and I've written like stuff that's like full on, like, you know, hardcore to a style, like, you know, sonnets and, you know, very specific requirements for the writing. And I've written screenplays, and I've written little short stories and things, and just over the years before, and then, you know, plenty since I started gaming. And so I think the thing that appeals to me most about role-playing games is telling the story together, in the improvisational aspect of it, of playing off of each other. You know, I've also done the things like performed at a Renaissance fair, done street theater sort of stuff where it's all just, you're playing a character for hours on end, and it's all improvisational, nothing scripted. There might be a little bit of guidance to certain parts, but it was mostly just make it up as you go. And so I really get into all of that stuff. Something that came up on another podcast that I did a couple of years ago was part of me too. I came to the realization that when you're a kid, you believe in magic to some extent or another. Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, Tooth Fairy, pixies, you know, things living under rocks, the monster under the bed. See your parents as super heroic. They do things you can't possibly imagine doing. Like there's all sorts of magical things in your world. And as you grow up, you lose more and more of that. You give up the magic. And I think that the people, like not in like, you know, wizard magic, but in the general sense of magical things. And I think that not necessarily in all cases, but a lot of people who play RPGs, who GM RPGs, who design them, who are interested in publishing and bringing them to the masses, who do artwork for those types of worlds that people create, who are involved in all of that stuff, that all of them need a little magic in their life, even if their adult life just doesn't have that anymore. And I think that for me, that certainly is the case. I love the idea of like little things that are unexplained, but you can kind of weave a story about why it is the way it is. And so I think a lot of it, or at least a part of it, is just wishing there was a little magic in the world. And creating a story together from nothing is a sort of magic.
What is that architectural design, the building that you have, whether it's just brainstorming sketches in a notebook or whether you've actually done proper blueprints for it? What's your white whale building that you as an architect, like what do you want? Because your maps have to be fucking amazing, right? It goes one of two ways, right? Because you're, as a chef, an individual is either a monster in the kitchen at home, or far more likely everybody's eating fucking grilled cheese and that's it, right? So in my mind, your maps are either A, Columbia Games Hardmaster quality, or they're garbage. So there you go. Let's unpack the little question first. How are your home maps?
Well, I don't do as much in the way of home maps as I used to, because I don't really play a lot of games that require maps now, like tactical, you know,
you're much
like
more narrative stuff. Gamer. Yeah, that was. Yeah, I wasn't going to get into
NerdBruger game stuff. Mm-hmm. Kind of NerdBruger games. Most of us stuff kind of leans that direction. I don't want to say they were garbage, but I think like when I was running D&D more, and I had a whole collection of like pre-done maps, and I would tailor adventures and encounters to utilize those maps that were made that had like they were like the nice ones with the plastic and you could write on them and stuff. And then I had dry erase, map grids that I could write on. Because I love the improvisation of it and kind of coming up with some stuff on the fly, is I usually didn't plan the map beforehand. I would kind of like figure out like what would be based on what we just described in the game and as we're playing it and what the characters are up to and what I know the encounter is going to be, what's the most interesting thing I can kind of throw together. And I would draw the map very quickly. And so it wouldn't be super duper detailed and amazing from an architect's standpoint. That said, on the flip side, the maps that I drew, the sketches that I drew to give to the cartographer when I wrote adventures that had maps for Dungeon Magazine were incredibly detailed and like ridiculously true to architectural stuff. Like there was always privies, there were toilets in places. Like, you know, you didn't have a gigantic church without a whole bunch of places to go poop. And, you know, I did an adventure at one point that was a lot of it took place in this ruined church temple. I made it cruciform, even though it wasn't Christian. So it was like, you know, it had a long axis and a short axis, but it had, you know, like all of the kind of typical, like I got very specific. I went and did a bunch of research. It's like, okay, well, what parts of a church or temple should this have based on the God that it's for, and how big should they be, and what relationship should they be to each other? Kind of looking at history, like how churches were designed, because with churches and temples, there's a progression and a celebration of what the faith is about that's symbolized in the church, like entering the church, walking down, you know, like walking through it to get to the worship space, how you get to the private spaces. Those were all designed with utility in mind, but also with a certain level of symbolism of what this religion is about. And so I gave a lot of thought to that sort of thing when I did, you know, when I sketched up 2 levels of this big church. And the cartographer made it look wonderful, you know, and added some flourishes and everything. But it more or less has like, you know, there were like these little cloisters off to the side where it's like, oh, this is where the clergy of the church slept. They had little cells, and they all, like 4 of them would share a little common area, and there would be a privy. And yeah,
so
I got very specific.
Before I get to the dream building, do you ever look at other people's maps and get pedantic?
No, because I also have a great sense of humor about all of fantasy maps and maps for games in general. I've often joked that my dungeons come without the 42-inch high code-required guardrails at the stairs and the overlooks, that there are never sufficient lighting facilities in any of these dungeons. Like, you can't navigate these properly. You don't have enough foot candles in here. People are going to be tripping up and down these stairs and on that lip of the dais constantly because they can't see anything. You know, I don't get that messy about it. I will say this though too, like there are times when, and I don't have any specific examples, I could probably go dig around and find one, where sometimes I see maps that people have done and I can see like, okay, this is a fantasy map they've drawn, like they've done a thing that kind of like, this is what people expect this thing to look like in a fantasy world. And every so often I see maps like, oh, that person studied that building. That looks like it should exist. Like there's some sense to that. And, you know, the really good cartographers will do stuff like that. They'll understand the idea of like, where are there really thick walls and where are the walls thinner? What's load bearing? How does this 4-story building stand up that's made out of stone, that isn't a steel skeleton where everything can be as thin as you need it to be on the skin of the building? Like, you know, there's just things like that. You see like, oh, they made like, you know, the outer wall very thick, and then they have a pair of inner walls that run down the middle of the building that's also very thick, because those are the 3 bays that the floors span across. And, you know, you can realistically do that. You could build that the way it's drawn, whereas like sometimes you see like, oh, somebody drew this giant, huge, sprawling map and it's got big, thick exterior walls, and then every wall on the interior is thin and there's no columns anywhere. And I'm like, how does this thing stand up? Like there's no way. You don't have enough width of stone to be carrying, you know, the weight above for 6 stories. Yes. Anyway, I don't get cranky when people do it inaccurately, but I notice it when it's done right.
Gotcha. Yeah. See, that's the kind of thing that I would never notice. But as a good old Missouri boy, I'm a gun guy, right? And again, I don't want to get into a whole 2A thing, but I'm a gun guy, and that shit drives me crazy, particularly in movies, right? In a role-playing game and comic books, whatever, I let it go. But if you spent $500 million making this fucking movie, your guns better be on point. Anyway, you've had plenty of time to deflect your dream building.
Oh, my dream building. I'll do this. I live in a condo, which is a nice condo, but it's pretty basic. It's kind of what you expect a condo to be. If I were to ever actually want a yard, and currently I don't, I would love to design my own house. And given my penchant for gaming, you might be surprised to say it would not be a castle. It would not be a big brick thing. I would love to do something super sleek and modernist, and lots of just clean lines, and really somebody looks at that and it's like, oh, that looks like it was printed by a gigantic 3D printer. It's so sleek and smooth, because I do have a thing. I do enjoy minimalist design when it comes to architectural kind of stuff. Really ostentatious and overly decorative things can drive me up the wall sometimes a little bit. But something that's really sleek and simplistic, but elegant.
I don't say this to pander. I say this because it's just sometimes the universe lines up coincidences, right? Sometimes the stars are right. My dream home would be from the RPG Capers, right? It would be it would be the secret crime boss hideout, right? So I would have the 3-story farmhouse with the porch that goes all the way around, with the cellar. But then, of course, I would have the library and the secret bookcase that goes down to the tunnel that leads you to the gaming room. And it would be that where the rec room would be set up. It's where I would have the PS5 and the giant TV and the role-playing game tables and the board game shelves and all that shit, right? That's precisely the direction that I would want to go. Before we get into your Kickstarter, I want to talk about Capers specifically, because you've got a lot of different games, but I also want to talk about Secrets of the Vibrant Isle. So if I can, let's put a pin in Vibrant Isle and take me to Capers, because looking at just the art on your website, it looks to me like it's 1920s era prohibition with superpowers.
Yes, that summarizes it. If you had a very, very short elevator ride, that is the very short elevator pitch.
Okay. Talk to me about talk to me about mechanics. How does the game's crunch work? Because I think that everyone can wrap their head around the 1920s. Everybody can wrap their head around superpowers. So they have an idea. They know what prohibition is, they know what bootlegging is, but how does the crunch differ from other games?
As is the case with a lot of the stuff that I've designed for NerdBruger Games, it's been I come up with a challenge for myself. I create this game or design the system as a personal challenge. And I had done plenty of stuff with dice in freelancing, and my first game, Murders and Acquisitions, I designed a dice system for that. It's a very simplest, fairly straightforward dice-based mechanic. And I thought, I really love Deadlands. Again, of all the games that aren't designed by me, it's my favorite. For all of its faults, the original Deadlands, I really dig. And it uses playing cards in a number of ways. And so I thought, what about designing Capers, this superpowered gangsters game, using a playing card mechanic instead of dice? What can I do with that? So I dove into that. And I tried, kind of in my head, tried out a few different things, and then kind of settled on a mechanic where it basically anything that you want to do, you have a trait score that's ranked between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you might have a skill that allows you to have an additional point. So if you're going to make a trait check, you have whatever your trait score is. Let's say it's 3, and you'll be able to flip 3 cards. You have a standard deck of playing cards with 2 jokers. One's a good joker, one's a bad joker. And you'll flip 3 cards one at a time, and you can choose to stick at any time. So you flip the first card. If you don't like that card, you can flip another one. If you don't like that card, you flip the third one, and then you're stuck with the third one if all you have is 3. And then the pip value of the card and the suit both play into the result of what happens. So the higher the pip value, the more likely you are to be successful, because you're shooting for target scores of you need a 9 or you need a queen or whatever, with ace high. And then the suit determines the the severity of the success or failure. So if it goes clubs worst alphabetically to diamonds, hearts, and spades. So clubs is always the worst suit, spades is always the best suit. So if you fail with clubs, it's always the worst. If you succeed with clubs, there's a complication that comes with it. If you fail with spades, you get a little something out of it, even though you fail. And if you succeed with spades, it's super good. And so you might flip the first card, and that's the king of clubs. Okay, well, the king is almost certainly successful, but clubs is a drawback. There's going to be a complication that takes place. Do you want to eat that complication or gamble and flip the next card? Because when you flip the next card, the other one's gone. And then you make your choice about where you're going to stick, or you get stuck with the final card. You do all of this without the GM telling you what the target score is. So it's all a gamble until you manage. Like if you play a game, eventually you can kind of narrow down where the target score is. If the characters are attacking a baddie, like you'll eventually figure out that, they've got a body score of Jack.
So when
like you need a Jack or better.
What triggers a reshuffle?
Two possibilities. One, the GM can have everybody reshuffle like when you get past a major encounter, usually it'll often be like a big combat. So you might have a few smaller encounters and then something big where everybody goes through a lot of cards. And then you reshuffle. But also in the game, your character, as a player, you have a resource called Moxie. And Moxie can be spent on a number of things. And one of the things it can be spent on is giving yourself a reshuffle. So if you know you've got a lot of high cards, a lot of face cards in your discard pile, therefore your deck is more likely to fail, you can go ahead and spend a Moxie and reshuffle those cards back up.
Each player then, as opposed to having their own pile of dice, they have their own deck of cards.
Correct.
And so each person's managing it. So then is the game master, I assume you're just running off one deck, or is it going to be more akin to like a Blades in the Dark where you're not engaging like that as the narrator?
As the GM, you have your own deck of cards. The mechanics do face you as well. You'll make checks flipping your cards. So oftentimes, I've found that the reshuffle, like the everybody reshuffle option, is more likely to happen because the GM is running low on cards. Because if I've got 4 players and I'm running a fight between 4 players and 4 baddies, I'm going to be flipping 4 times as many cards as you. So I'll go through my deck a lot faster. But you have the option of spending Moxie to get those aces back in your deck if you draw them all early.
I definitely would like to check that out, because I used to play a miniatures game called Malifaux, and Malifaux had its own deck of, so you know what I'm talking about. It was I'm familiar. Yeah, it really interesting. Well, they even had their own Through the Breach, I believe it was called, their own RPG that used the same system. But I love that era. Cullen Bunn years ago wrote a comic book, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember the name of it. If I had a producer, I would have them Google it for me. But it was about gangsters in the Prohibition era. And I'll make sure that I have this for the show notes. But instead of superpowers, it was all demons, right? So it was black magic and demons. And so all of the great crime families were actually demons of different kinds. And it was wonderful stuff. Anyway, the other game I wanted to get into, and dude, I could talk to you forever about your catalog of stuff, but as I was going through looking at your website, your RPGs, your little games, your older stuff like Murders and Acquisitions. But the thing that got me was Secrets of the Vibrant Isle. And the reason I say that is, for somebody as much as I try to be tuned in to, dialed into what's going on in the hobby and the hobby zeitgeist, the solo RPG is not something, it's just a blind spot for me. First, if you could kind of walk me through what the solo RPG is for the listener, if they're unfamiliar, and then next kind of talk to me about Secrets of the Vibrant Isle, and that will probably be a good transition to your upcoming Kickstarter.
Sure. At its most basic, a solo RPG is what it sounds like. It's a game for just one person, where you are going to play the game by yourself. And so there will be some level of, role playing, of putting yourself in the shoes of a character rather than it being something abstract like playing solitaire with a deck of cards. And they vary. There are a lot of solo RPGs that are very small in scale that are what people refer to as journaling RPGs, where the primary way that you interact with the game is by writing a journal or a diary, a list of letters, a series of letters. It could be like any literary writing form that you can think of. You might write a poem as part of it. You know, some games might have you write a poem, but from the point of view, or kind of incorporating this character that you're role playing. And then the journaling game might have prompts, things that kind of tell you, that kind of guide you through the process of what this game is about. They often have very specific themes. And then, kind of sort of on the other end of the spectrum are things that are a little more adventure-y game oriented, where they're a little more robust. You might have a character with actual stats. You might roll more dice. And the game guides you or provides some sort of a framework to have some sort of adventure in this world that the game presents to you. And that can be something that's, kind of D&D-ish in its nature. It can be a fantasy thing. You could fight monsters. You could fight against your own demons. You can take it whichever direction you want. And they tend to be more robust, bigger books. They might take longer to play, although some of the journaling games can get very long if you're, if you've got a lot to write. And then, so like with Secrets of the Vibrant Isle, which came out last year, that's more of like the latter type. It's more of an adventure game. The book is 72 pages, I think. And the conceit of the game is your character has shipwrecked on the Vibrant Isle, a place of legend. It's a mystical, magical island. You've been seeking this. You've looked for this. You came here on purpose, and you found it. But the island doesn't let just anybody stay. You have to prove that you are worthy of remaining. And so in the gameplay, you have 4 weeks, and you track your days on the island. And you have 4 weeks to prove to the island and to the inhabitants that you will meet eventually that you deserve to stay. And so there's a whole series of things you can do. You can scavenge your shipwreck. You can go searching for inhabitants once you kind of have evidence that they're there. You can spend time improving yourself, like advancing your character, essentially learning, becoming better. And you can explore the island. And a great deal of the game is exploring the island. And that's done with random dice rolls that take you to all sorts of different places on the island. And every one is like a little half page blurb that kind of sets up like, this is the location you find. Here's the interesting thing about it. And here's something that happens to you, or some sort of skill check that you will make, or whatever that will affect your character in some way. And you can play through a whole series of those explorations and go around, and you'll eventually meet the inhabitants of the island. Well, that's the basics. Do you have any questions? I don't want to
No. That sounds so mechanically. Then
there's a little more to it. Yeah, and we'll get to that.
It sounds like that it is. What's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of a marriage between a choose your own adventure novel and Zorg, right? Where it is a choose your own adventure that is far more in depth, and I'm doing a lot of the writing.
Choose your own adventure is a good way to look at it. There's a fair bit of that. Like each action that you have 2 actions per day, because it takes you a bunch of time to do each of these actions. You choose what you want to do. And one of the, there's only a handful of things that you do, but one of them is explore the island. And then you roll percentile dice, and there's 90 possible encounters. If you roll doubles, you encounter the inhabitants. The other 90 results are 90 specific encounters. And so you'll make checks along the way too. You'll have your 4 traits in the game are discover, interact, learn, and survive. Discover covers everything about like finding things on the island. Interact is interacting with the inhabitants, but also with like other creatures and animals and things that you come across. And learn is learning about the island. Survive is like all the kind of physical stuff, like staying alive.
Yeah. Not only do I think that is a really good tool in terms of the current movement of using role-playing games therapeutically. And I think that there are definitely applications for the solo RPG where someone could work out a lot of their damage using something like this. But also, if I were new to role-playing games, if I was still working a store, this is something that I would want to turn people toward. Because if you want to learn what a role-playing game is and you don't have a group and you don't want to invest a lot of time or effort because you might not dig it, I think something like this is a great way to go in terms of is this something that I want to do? And is this something that I want to try with a group of people? Even if I'm a gamer, if I want to learn to game master and sort of get more into the creative process, I can do this at my own pace. I'm sad that I missed that boat when I was a kid, but I'm glad that I have old friends of many years that I can game with. But that's very cool. Now, with that said, if I understand correctly, you have a new solo coming out.
Yes.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. Let me get back to with my solo game Wank. Let me get back to the inhabitants and encountering the inhabitants and ultimately how the game comes to a conclusion.
So, if you roll doubles, and there's ways to manipulate your dice a little bit too, so you can get to doubles if you don't, if you get unlucky and just don't roll them. You encounter the inhabitants, and the inhabitants on the island are not described specifically. You will kind of world build them as you play, and you go through 5 encounters where the first time you just kind of glimpse someone, right? You get I can kind of see like they're 4 feet tall and they have wings. That's all I know. So you decide that, and then the next time you encounter the inhabitants, you get closer and you learn more, and eventually you just kind of build along that, and eventually you find out that they have like these capabilities, like skills of their own that are kind of useful in gameplay. And then by the time you get to the 5th encounter, then now you've made friends. They've invited you to visit their community, and you haven't quite integrated with the community at this point, but you're on the cusp of doing so. So you have to get through those 5 encounters at least with the inhabitants. But of course, once you see the inhabitant one time, you can actually choose to go seeking them out. So you can get there pretty easily. And then when your time is running short in your 4 weeks that you have, it's time to go to a finale. And there are 5 different finales. You can roll randomly for them, or you can just pick the one that kind of suits you. And all of the finales have to do with integrating your character with the inhabitants and their society and their community in some way. You might help to prepare a feast. They have a big feast celebration, so you're going to contribute to that. Or you might take part in a race, like a feats of strength, sort of, feats of skill across the island that they have, like an annual thing, one of their rituals. So you'll compete in or get otherwise involved in one of these things, and you'll have a series of checks, and there's tasks to take and try to accomplish, and a limited amount of time to do it. So you end up under the gun, and hopefully the things that you've discovered through your explorations and everything help you, give you better bonuses and all that sort of thing. And if you succeed at your finale, then you are accepted into the community and you are able to stay on the island. And if you don't, the island expels you and says you don't get to come back.
So there is definitely a risk reward. There's a resource management aspect to it. There's the creativity, the writing aspect to it. You're creating the inhabitants of the island as you're discovering them. It sounds like it's got great replay value. It also, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it's pretty conflict-free in terms of violence.
There's a handful of fighty situations, like you can encounter monsters on the island.
Oh, okay.
But it's just some of the encounters, right? A lot of the encounters are much more benign and just fantastical, and some of them might feel a little trippy because, like myself and Shireen Gilchrist, the co-writer, we kind of went after like this place is mystical and magical, and so all sorts of weird things happen. You might come across like some very bizarre, what were they smoking when they wrote this bit? It's a possibility that you were thinking that. But there is, there's no character death. Like your character doesn't die. If your character gets into a fight and loses, essentially, the worst that happens is you spend some of your actions recovering. So you lose some of your time that you have available.
And you're getting ready to launch the Kickstarter for the sequel, correct?
Yeah. Secrets of the Vibrant Sea, which is not just a solo game and not just an island or not just an exploration game like the first one. It is literally a sequel to the first one. It assumes that your character is on the island and they have been accepted into this community. Now, that said, you can play it standalone. You can whip together your island inhabitants because that inhabitant is going to accompany you when you go to explore the magical ocean around the island. So it's not just you, like in the first game where you started out by yourself. And so it's got information for how to kind of cover the things that happen as part of the first game, or you can play the first game through and then continue the story with your character. And it's worth noting too that in both instances, you can play the game as just kind of an adventure game that you succeed or fail and you get to the win condition, and do you manage to do the thing or not. But there's also guidance for, like, you can treat it like a journaling thing. You can write your character's diary as you go. You can expand the world of the game, describe more of the island, all those sorts of things. You can map the island as part of the game. There's all sorts of things you can do. Yeah, and then in Secrets of the Vibrant Sea, you and your island friend, who now is with you as a companion, go to explore the ocean. And it's the basics of the game is very similar to Secrets of the Vibrant Isle, except that now you're underwater. So you're having to deal with certain different types of threats and encounters and things that you run into. And there's, again, all of these different encounters. There's inhabitants down there that you will slowly meet, and eventually you'll kind of become accepted by their community. And so by the time you get to the end of Secrets of the Vibrant Sea, there's you and an island inhabitant and an ocean inhabitant. And all three of you will then, and so effectively both of these communities, as with the three of you as their representatives, are going to deal with a threat that is rising that might wipe out the island and the sea around it. And the setup to that is there's, again, 5 different finales. You can roll randomly or pick one, and they're all tied in some way to the people who tried to get to the island but couldn't and died there in the ocean. So there's a little more of a darkness of, like, there's spirits beneath the sea. There's ghosts and people that are seeking the island for their own purposes. And the island said, no, you don't belong here. And it sent a wave to capsize them, or a sea monster to drag them to the deep, or whatever. So now they're looking to get direct revenge, or they're doing something that is otherwise disrupting the ecosystem of this area.
At what backer level do I get both? Because obviously there is a backer level where I get the new game and I get part 1. So that's my first question.
There's going to be essentially, I think, 4 backer levels. You can get just the PDF of the sequel, or you can get the book and the PDF of the sequel, and then there's 2 levels that get you both PDF. You want both PDFs or you want both books. There's a backer level for that as well.
When does the Kickstarter for Secrets of the Vibrant Sea launch?
Fingers crossed, May 17th. It's a Tuesday, right? If I recall correctly, yeah, it's May 17th.
May 17th is a Tuesday. Yeah.
Assuming I get the page approved and everything and good to go, like that's the plan. It'll run for about a month, and it'll end on whatever that Thursday is 4 weeks later.
Gotcha. So for the person listening to this episode, it is either the 3rd or the 4th. So you're still a couple weeks out from the launch of the Kickstarter.
But it's possible. Like as soon as I get this thing approved, there'll be a landing page. So you can look for it on Kickstarter. You can go and press a button, so you'll get a notice like when it goes live. So there's a way to kind of get on the list that way too.
Perfect. And I'll make sure to link that. If you can email it to me, I'll link that in the show notes. So people, if they hear about it, they can just dump right here. Are there mechanical differences in sea versus island? For example, my first instinct is, because I have a companion, is it going to be like some of the popular video games where I have to also manage and keep safe my companion? Are they an asset? Are they a burden? Is it a little column A, a little column B?
You don't have to specifically manage them, and they are an asset. Inhabitants, and then there are other ways to earn friends on the in both games too, where you can meet a little creature and it has like this cool ability, and it becomes a helper. And if you use the ability, then they say, okay, and now I helped you, and they go on their way. But if you don't use their ability for like 3 days on the island, they become a friend, and then you can use their ability once per day.
So if you build a rapport,
they hang around. Yeah. And so with the friend that you have from the island, when you go under the water, they've got abilities that can aid you, and they're always there. And so there's not anything like, they're not going to leave you. The game presupposes that you're there for good purposes, that you're not mistreating anybody, that the two of you are friends and you're exploring and having an adventure together. There are minor mechanical differences, but nothing it's just adjustments from the first game. It's not like anything brand new. So if you know the first game, the second game will be very easy to just roll right into.
What's the age floor? How young can I be to play this game?
Well, there's quite a lot of reading involved. So it's as far as if you wanted to have younger players, it's a question of kind of their number one, reading ability, and number two, like their attention span for reading. But the great thing about the game is you can literally just break it up and be like, I'll play the first 5 days, and then I'll come back later and I'll play 3 more days, and then so you can break it up into pieces very easily. So I mean, any kid that's double digits or better, I'm sure would be perfectly fine with the game. Younger than that, it becomes like, the parent or the older sibling or something that kind of has to make a judgment call. But there's also advice for how to do it with a GM and a player, where the player just plays the character and the GM and rolls dice and makes choices and all that sort of stuff. And then the GM does all the reading and kind of helps to set up the scenes and explain the world and everything too. So there's an option for playing it that way.
Gotcha. So if I wanted to, if I was a retailer, I could do a nice display with my No Thank You Evil or some of my other kids' games and say, hey, if you read with your child at night, this is a really interesting way to go about it. So instead of reading you a bedtime story, we're going to have a bedtime adventure. And
sure.
Yeah, I'll do the DM role and you'll do the PC role, and that'll be that. And maybe we cover a day each night before bedtime or whatever. That sounds fantastic. So I
really like that.
Yeah, thank you. With the, like I said, I mean, retail's what I did, and I'd make a little display and what have you, but I'm a dork. Before we go any further, and before we get into my last and probably most essential question for the interview, where, Craig, can people find you if they want to get your material, if they want to check out your games? Obviously, DriveThruRPG, I'm going to guess, but if they want to get specifically your brand, where do we go?
Well, the website is NerdBrugerGames.com. The games are all available at DriveThruRPG.com. If you want capers or good strong hands, for both of those, I did an offset print run. So it's not just the print on demand stuff that you get through DriveThru. But if you want the print, the really nice book that's sewn binding in better color and will hold up a lot better, those are only either find them at a convention that I'm at, or you can get them at the website. And then I'm at NerdBurger Craig on Twitter, and NerdBurger Games has a Discord as well. There's a link to finding that via both my Twitter and via the website. So we've got a nice little community of people, and I'm always talking about what I'm working on. So if you like that kind of behind the scenes stuff, the Discord's a great place for that. And there's all sorts of cool people that are just talking about game design stuff and geeky stuff in general. Yeah, that's everything. Well, there's a Patreon too.
So what do people get for being your patron?
Well, the Patreon is specifically to get Capers Cyber underway.
What is Capers Cyber?
Well, Capers takes place in the 1920s, right? And there's multiple supplements that take you into the 40s and the 60s, and it kind of morphs the game into different things. In the 1940s, Capers Noir is more of a crime noir with mystery and some horror elements. And then Capers Covert is set in the 1960s, and it's super villains and super spies, kind of old school James Bond style with superpowers and gadgets and whatnot. And then there's Capers Offworld, which is a science fiction-y alternate thing, retro future space cops and robbers. But Capers Cyber is something that I've kind of had in mind for the end game, so to speak, of the Capers universe, which is set in an alternate 2020s, alternate now, with the idea that because of all these superpowered people, including super smart and super creative and so forth people, the world progresses through technology a little bit faster, and the corporations starting with governments, but then also very much corporations rise up and start to commoditize. Yeah, they commoditize the capers, the people with powers, and commoditize research around powers like that, and it so builds mega corporations that come about, and so it's an alternate 2020s. Superpowered criminals with cyber tech battling the megacorps. So in Capers, they're the criminals, and in Capers Cyber, they're the heroes that are going to save humanity from the cyber tech, or from the megacorps.
So it's just got a dash of Shadowrun, right? Where we're the protagonists against the corpse.
Yep. essentially. And I've been working on a bunch of it for a while, just kind of in bits and pieces. And I decided I'm going to pull the trigger and start kind of counting down to get to it. And the Patreon, coming back around to that, is starting in June. Everybody, like once a month, there'll be anybody who's a patron on the Patreon will get a look at the game design stuff as it's going along, setting and lore, new powers, what the rules are going to look like, all the stuff that's being developed, a timeline of the history that gets us to that place, all that sort of thing. And then all of the money that comes into the Patreon goes immediately to the artist to start concepting and then start developing art for Capers Cyber, which will help to take the sting out of the size of the crowdfunding effort of the Kickstarter, right? Later there'll be, I'm envisioning a bigger book than Capers, plenty of art, and art is usually the single most expensive item in getting a book put together. At least for me, it is. So, the patrons will get a chance to kind of see all of this in development, including the artwork and the design and the world of Capers Cyber as their reward for patronizing and helping out. And then when we get to the Kickstarter, the goal won't have to be quite as big because a bunch of the artwork will be done and covered already.
Kickstarter used to be a thing where people would go, or at least initially, it was a thing where people would go and say, I have a dream, help me fund this dream. But now you have to go to Kickstarter pretty much ready to go to print before you launch the damn thing. I don't know. I don't know. I feel like that people missed the opportunity to use Kickstarter for its intended purpose. Am I wrong?
I think your opinion is colored a bit, perhaps, by the Kickstarters that get noticed. Is like as far as big companies that do, that are able to get a lot more done up front and have the game be almost ready to go, et cetera, that sort of thing. I think there are lots and lots and lots of people who still put their dream on Kickstarter, and maybe they can afford, like for an RPG, for example, like I can afford to get a little bit of artwork done just to get the point across. And now I'm going to get people on board, and it's going to take me, 6 months, a year and a half, however long, tell the backers how long to finish the thing up. And actually now I can afford to have my words edited, and I can get some more artwork and get it laid out and blah, blah, blah. I think that the stuff that is like nearly ready to go is oftentimes from bigger, more well-known creators and producers, or is at the very least gets a little more press and up front for that reason. I think there's still plenty of people that like they get on there and then they're like, okay, now I got to make it happen, and it's going to take a year and a half to do it, but I've got the funds to actually cover the things that I need to do. And I'll say this too, is the failed Kickstarter has made a lot of people wary about backing things that are going to take a long time. And it's made a lot of creators wary about putting out something that's not fairly close to completion, so that they can tell the backers that it's fairly close to completion, so that they don't have people skip it. Because anybody who's backed a number of Kickstarters has probably had a failure, like an egregious failure, like you got nothing. You
got satanic panicked. Yeah, no, for sure. I don't know if you know that game or the whole Jim McClure story, but that's industry drama that I adore.
There's worse ones than that.
What? Are you serious? I mean, I know. Well, I mean, yeah. we can talk about the Robotech board game and about that whole thing happened with Symbieta and yada yada. Yeah, no, there's all sorts of wonderful drama in this industry. I love it. I absolutely love it. But I also try not to talk about it on the record because I don't want to be that. You know what I mean? I don't want to have a bad interview with you and you're like, dude, I had that Brodor guy, Pete. What the actual fuck? Anyway.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of people that are still they're making their dream happen via Kickstarter. They just maybe they're not getting the press, and people aren't remembering. People are remembering the people that are like, oh, it's just about ready to go.
I don't have a lot going on financially, but dude, I tried to buy Satanic Panic. I literally reached out to Jim and we had an agreed upon price. And then he started posting on Kickstarter again, said he was going to get back to it, and then he just disappeared. And I even talked to an IP attorney. I should not admit this, but I was like, how much can I take without getting sued? Because I think that idea of playing government agents in the era of Dungeons and Dragons and the Satanic Panic, where you're literally going and prosecuting with extreme prejudice people that are playing tabletop because they're allowing Satan and demons into the world. Like everything about D&D that they said at that time period is true, and you're the good guys and you have to kill D&D players. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. But anyway.
I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I know. I do that. I do that a lot. We get to the end of the interview and I have so much energy and tension built up. I don't know what to do with it. However, before we wrap, I do have one more question that I want to ask you. I understand that Star Wars was a long, long time ago before the advent of OSHA, but as an architect, you can see clearly how unsafe everything is in Star Wars. What's going on there? I need help, Craig. I need to understand, like, were they just cutting corners? Do they not care about safety? Is it a Darwinism thing? What's going on?
Well, I think the Empire probably came in and snuffed out any agencies that the Republic had in place to put those sort of safety measures into place and just kick down all that stuff. And so nothing got maintained. And so everything just got torn out when it started to look like crap. And then on the flip side, a lot of people, like Tatooine, why doesn't Tatooine have a bunch of, like, why isn't there a fence around the Sarlacc pit to warn people not to go there? I think it's backwater. Like there's just, like it's the Wild West. There's just, you chose to go out in the dune seat. It's on you if you fall in the Sarlacc pit.
Okay. I'm paraphrasing here. I'm not quoting you, but so essentially, because of extreme fascist distaste for regulation and planets being on the outer rim, this is why we don't have safety. Got it.
Yeah. Well, who puts that control on the edge of that little lip walkway that Obi-Wan has to go out to? Like, why isn't that in just a room over there with a lock on it?
Well, what the actual fuck? My wife is probably one of the smartest people that I know, although she's got terrible taste in men. And anytime something Star Wars is on, she just pauses it. She's like, where the fuck is OSHA? Where is OSHA? And so as an architect, I wanted to take the opportunity and find out for the woman who I love, where is OSHA in the Star Wars universe? And I think we have a pretty fantastic theory to go on. Seriously, Craig, is there anything?
I'll say this real quick sideline. It's not just the Star Wars universe. It's watch movies and TV shows. Nobody crawls around in air ducts. Those things are super thin. They're held up by wires.
Yeah,
they're not big enough to crawl through. John McClane falls down the elevator shaft and then kicks open a vent and gets into a duct. Like no duct opens into an elevator shaft without there being a grate in place to be able to close off and keep that elevator shaft from becoming a smoke tunnel. Because an elevator shaft, the biggest danger of an elevator shaft in case of a fire is transmitting smoke from floor to floor. So there's what's called fire dampers. They're big grates that slam shut. If there's a fire, whoop, they shut and they don't let smoke through. So you don't pass smoke from one area of the building to another through a firewall, through a smoke wall, up an elevator shaft. So yeah, there's all that crap.
Are you Grimtooth?
No, but if I was, I wouldn't tell you.
But you make amazing traps, don't you? I bet somewhere in a safe with all of your darkest secrets, there is a binder of the most beautiful, brilliant, modern day, perfectly plausible, functional traps. Am I right?
I'm not sure I should answer that. That sounds like a recipe for not getting players to play in my game.
That sounds incriminating. Well, Craig Campbell, thank you so much for your time. I have to tell you, this is not me trying to get free stuff, but I'm definitely going to get a copy of Capers. That is something that I know that my group, my table, we're all people who will very, very much dig that vibe. We hate technology in our games. We hate any game where I don't have the internet forward. That's the era in which I want to play. So phones being a pain in the ass, radios being a pain in the ass, no fucking television, tiny little tires. That's the game. A game where I can buy a machine gun in the fucking mail. That is the game I want to play. Any which way. Seriously, Craig, thank you for your time. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you very much for having me on the show here. It's been a blast.
All right, writer, freelance guy, genius, Craig Campbell. It was wonderful having you on Why We Game. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Barotor. Audio editing by yours truly. Music by 99 Instrumentals. And don't be mistaken, that beautiful fellow at the beginning of the episode is Chris O'Neill from 9th Level Games as Yeet. Don't take that for me. It's not me. I'm not that smart. I'm not that clever. And remember, the only thing more offensive than speech crime is thought crime.